For decades, the official version went unquestioned. A poor family from a steel town, a father with a vision and a belt, 5 boys, then 6, harmonizing in a cramped living room because the radio was the only school they could afford. And then, as the legend insists, a single moment of discovery, Diana Ross, dazzled, presenting them to the world, anointing them, as if greatness had simply been waiting in a doorway to be noticed. It is a beautiful story. It is also, in large part, a lie. And the proof of that lie sat silently on a reel of magnetic tape for 42 years, decaying in a box until a journalist chasing a much smaller story pulled a thread that unraveled everything. To understand why a single piece of lost audio could rewrite the early history of the most famous family in the history of American music, you first have to understand the silence they came from. Not silence in the poetic sense, actual, literal silence. The kind that exists in a house where 5 boys are too afraid to make noise without permission. The kind that exists in a city where the sky is the color of rust, because the air itself is full of the steel mill's breath. Gary, Indiana, in the early 1960s, was not a place that produced dreams so much as it processed men. It took them young, fed them into furnaces, and returned them home gray with exhaustion, smelling of metal and sweat. Joseph Jackson worked the crane at U.S. Steel, hauling slabs of molten metal 80 feet above the factory floor, a job that demanded total concentration because a single lapse meant death. He carried that same demand for total concentration home with him every single night. There was no room in Joseph Jackson's house for almost. There was no room for nearly. A note sung slightly flat was not a mistake to be corrected gently. It was treated, by his own children's later accounts, as a failure to be punished. The belt that hung in that house was not decoration. It was a metronome. What the public would later be sold as discipline was, inside those walls, something closer to military doctrine. Katherine Jackson, a Jehovah's Witness who believed deeply in scripture and restraint, watched her husband mold their sons into a unit with the same cold precision he applied to steel. Michael, the youngest of the performing brothers, would later describe in his own words being struck, being mocked for the shape of his nose, being made to rehearse until his legs shook and his voice cracked from exhaustion, and being expected the very next morning to smile for an audience as though none of it had happened. This was the curriculum: pain in private, perfection in public, and the world, for the next 60 years, would only ever be shown the second half of that equation. The talent shows came first. Roosevelt High School, the Apollo, local Gary auditoriums where 5 black boys from a steel mill family competed against the city's best for a few dollars and a moment of dignity. Teachers at their school, women named Genevieve Gray and Eugene Chambers, had spotted something in them long before any record executive ever did and pushed them onto small stages to test it. This detail alone matters more than it seems. The myth insists Michael Jackson was discovered. The truth is that he was built, performance by performance, bruise by bruise, in rooms with bad lighting and worse pay, years before anyone outside Gary, Indiana, ever knew his name. It was here, in 1967, that the actual story begins. Not the story Motown would later manufacture for magazine covers, but the real one, scattered across 2 competing record labels, a handful of broke entrepreneurs, and a master tape that almost nobody knew existed. A Gary businessman named Gordon Keith ran a tiny operation called Steeltown Records out of partnership with 4 friends, men with day jobs and modest savings, chasing the same dream as everyone else in that town. That talent could be the one thing the mills couldn't crush. Keith signed the Jackson brothers to a 6-month contract in November of 1967. Their first single, a song called Big Boy, fronted by a 9-year-old Michael, was recorded shortly after and released in January of 1968. For more than 4 decades, this was treated as historical fact, written into liner notes, repeated in biographies, accepted by fans and historians alike as the absolute beginning. The first sound, the first take, the first proof that something extraordinary was forming in that small, frightened household. It wasn't, quote, hidden inside a separate, almost entirely forgotten Chicago label called Wonderful Records, was a secret that even the people who owned the company didn't fully understand they possessed. Before Gordon Keith ever brought the Jacksons into a studio, the brothers had already been recorded, months earlier, in July of 1967, at a different facility entirely, playing their own instruments with Michael already singing lead at just 9 years old. This session had not been lost in the way a memory fades. It had been physically lost, a tape, mislabeled, misplaced, sitting in storage, unconnected in anyone's mind to the family that would one day be called the most successful musical act of the 20th century. For more than 40 years, nobody went looking for it because nobody knew it was missing. You cannot search for a ghost you don't believe exists. That changed because of curiosity, not ambition. A guitarist who had played on forgotten sessions decades earlier mentioned, almost in passing, to a Chicago journalist named Jake Austin, that there might be an earlier Jackson recording out there somewhere, something that predated the official first single by months. Austin had been researching a much smaller piece about the Steeltown years. He had no idea he was about to become the investigator who would force music history to rewrite its own opening chapter. Austin followed the lead with the patience of a man chasing a rumor he half expected to dissolve under scrutiny. He tracked the guitarist's memory back to a Chicago label most music fans had never heard of, then began the slow, frustrating work of finding people who were still alive and still willing to talk. Eventually, the trail led him to Eric Leaner, one of 4 siblings who had inherited the masters of wonderful records from their late father, Ernie. When Austin called and explained that there might be an unreleased Jackson 5 tape sitting somewhere in the family's possession, Leaner later admitted he felt something close to disbelief. He had already gone through those tapes before. As far as he knew, there was nothing left to find. He asked his brother-in-law, a man named Herb Newkirk, to look one more time, mostly out of politeness. A few days later, the phone rang. Newkirk had found it. A reel, hand-labeled, dated July of 1967, the ink faded but legible enough to read 3 words that would quietly detonate decades of accepted history: Jackson 5, Big Boy. There is something almost unbearably human about how this discovery happened. Not a vault, not a corporate archive with climate control and white gloves. A box in a house half remembered, found because a man did a favor for his brother-in-law and didn't expect to find anything. The most significant artifact in the early life of the most scrutinized entertainer of the 20th century had been sitting 20 minutes from where it was recorded, gathering dust for 42 years. When the tape was finally handled carefully enough to be assessed, the technical condition alone told its own story. One reel from that era was so deteriorated, so warped and flaking, that experts feared it might never be safely played at all. But the July reel, the one carrying that fragile 9-year-old voice, had somehow survived in remarkably good shape. It was as if time itself had decided that this particular truth was not allowed to disappear completely. What did it actually reveal? On its surface, the discovery seemed almost narrow. A date correction, a footnote for collectors, proof that one song had been recorded a few months earlier than previously assumed, but underneath that narrow fact sat something far larger, something that mattered to anyone who had ever wondered how mythology forms around real human beings. It proved that the clean, simple origin story sold to the public for decades was, at best, incomplete, and at worst, a deliberate simplification designed to serve a brand rather than the truth. Motown's own publicity machine had spent years insisting that Diana Ross personally discovered the Jackson 5, a story so widely repeated it became accepted fact, recycled in interviews, magazine profiles, even an official 1992 television miniseries. Berry Gordy himself would later admit, almost casually, that the story had been invented for promotional purposes. A clean narrative beat easier to sell than the messy, unglamorous reality of 5 boys grinding through talent contests in Gary and recording sessions in Chicago basements for men who could barely afford to press a single. The lost tape didn't just correct a date, it exposed the machinery of myth-making itself, the way an industry built around image will quietly erase inconvenient truths and replace them with whichever version photographs better. It revealed that long before Motown ever touched them, the Jackson brothers had already been commodities, already been bought, sold, and shuffled between competing labels and competing claims of ownership, each man involved insisting then and decades later that he was the one who truly discovered Michael. Gordon Keith said it. Ben Brown, Steeltown's president, said it. Teachers at Roosevelt High believed it was them. Berry Gordy built an entire promotional fiction around Diana Ross saying it. Almost nobody in any of these competing claims paused to ask what the boys themselves felt while being passed again and again from one set of adult hands to another, each one certain they had found something worth owning. This is the part of the story that rarely makes it into documentaries built for nostalgia. The lost audio did not just reveal an inconvenient timeline, it reframed an entire childhood. Because if the official story was wrong about something as simple and verifiable as a recording date, fans and historians alike began asking, with renewed urgency, what else had been smoothed over for the sake of a better headline? What else had been quietly edited out of the official record because it didn't fit the narrative of a joyful family destined for stardom? It is here that the deeper, harder truths resurface. Truths that were never technically hidden, but were rarely placed in the foreground because they complicated the fairy tale. Michael Jackson himself, in his own memoir and in extended interviews later in his life, described a childhood defined less by joy than by relentless pressure. He spoke of being struck during rehearsals when a step or a note fell short of his father's standard. He spoke of being ridiculed for his appearance, comments that would quietly shape a lifetime of difficult feelings about his own face. He spoke of watching his brothers endure the same treatment, of a household where affection was rare and discipline was constant, where the difference between love and control was never clearly drawn. None of this contradicts the music, it deepens it, because the same 9-year-old whose voice now sits preserved on that recovered tape, light, untrained, almost unbearably innocent, was, by his own later account, already living inside a system that demanded adult-level perfection from a child's body and a child's nervous system. Poverty in Gary was not simply a lack of money. It functioned more like a weather pattern the entire family lived inside, something that shaped every decision, every fear, every reason Joseph Jackson pushed so hard. He had grown up with almost nothing. He worked a job that could kill him in a single careless second. He looked at his sons and saw, perhaps honestly, the only escape route his family was ever going to get. That desperation does not excuse cruelty, but it explains with a kind of tragic clarity why a father might convince himself that breaking his children down was the only way to build them into something the world couldn't ignore. The lost tape, in other words, did something far more important than settling a discography dispute. It cracked open the curated version of events just enough to remind everyone that history, especially celebrity history, is written by whoever controls the cameras and the contracts, and that the people living inside that history rarely get to correct the record while it's still being shaped. It is worth sitting for a moment with the strange intimacy of that recovered recording. A boy's voice captured on outdated equipment in a modest Chicago studio, syllables not yet shaped by stardom, years before sequins and stadiums and a surname that would eventually become inseparable from both genius and scandal. Listening to it now, knowing everything that came after, the meteoric rise, the unbearable scrutiny, the allegations that would follow him for the rest of his life and continue, even now, to follow his legacy. There is something almost unbearable about hearing that particular innocence preserved on tape, frozen in a moment before any of it had happened to him yet. That tension between the preserved innocence of the past and the complicated weight of the present has never fully gone away. In 2026, audiences watched a major studio biopic bring Michael Jackson's early years back to the screen, using the very Steeltown-era recordings, the same pre-Motown material this lost tape discovery helped resurrect into public consciousness as part of its soundtrack, a deliberate choice to root the film in the unvarnished pre-fame reality rather than only the polished spectacle that came later. At the very same time, far from any film set, new legal filings reignited public reckoning with the darker accusations that have shadowed Jackson's adult life and legacy, with a fresh civil lawsuit alleging a pattern of abuse and exploitation, and even a Senate inquiry examining how institutions failed to intervene in similar cases of alleged exploitation involving powerful figures. The same year that celebrated his earliest, most innocent recorded breath also reopened some of the gravest accusations ever made against the man he became. It would be dishonest, and a disservice to a story this complicated, to separate those two threads entirely. The boy on that 1967 tape and the man named in court filings nearly 60 years later are undeniably the same person, and any honest reckoning with the Jackson family's legacy has to hold both truths without flinching from either one. So, the documented suffering inflicted on him as a child, and the serious, documented allegations of harm he is accused of inflicting on others as an adult, neither cancels the other out. Both are part of the unfinished record this family has left behind, and both continue, even now, to be argued over in courtrooms, in documentaries, in fan communities still divided over how to hold a legacy this fractured. What the lost audio ultimately forces us to confront is not simply a corrected date on a record label's liner notes. It forces us to confront how fragile the official version of any story really is, how easily a tragic, complicated human history can be flattened into something simple enough to sell. A discovery story, a redemption arc, a tidy myth about a family lifted out of poverty by destiny, rather than relentless, sometimes brutal labor. The tape sat silent for 42 years, not because anyone was actively hiding it, but because nobody had any reason to look. The myth was comfortable. The myth was profitable. The myth required nothing of anyone except admiration. The truth, as it so often does, required something harder. It required sitting with the image of small boys recording in a basement studio because their father believed, perhaps correctly, that it was their only way out of a town that ate men alive. It required acknowledging that nearly every adult who claims credit for discovering Michael Jackson was, in some sense, also claiming ownership of a child's labor before that child had any legal or emotional ability to consent to the bargain being made on his behalf. And it required, eventually, holding space for both the wounded boy on that recording and the deeply troubling allegations made against the adult he grew into, a tension American culture still has not figured out how to sit with comfortably decades after his death, and likely never fully will. Perhaps that is the real, lasting lesson hidden inside a piece of magnetic tape that almost nobody believed still existed. Memory does not preserve people. It preserves fragments, and the stories we choose to build around those fragments depend entirely on who is doing the telling and what they need that story to mean. A box in an attic can outlast a lifetime of carefully managed publicity. A single recovered recording can quietly unravel 60 years of accepted fact. And yet even now, with the tape finally heard, with the timeline finally corrected, with the myths finally complicated by documented truth, the deepest question the Jackson family's history leaves behind remains unanswered and may simply be unanswerable. Not what happened. We know now much closer to what actually happened. The harder question is what we are willing to do with a truth that refuses to be simple, a truth that asks us to grieve for the child and reckon with the man in the same breath without looking away from either.